are Daniel Cameron, Attorney General for the great Commonwealth of Kentucky. I certainly won't read the bio, but suffice it to say that Daniel's the 51st Attorney General of the state of Kentucky, Commonwealth of Kentucky, in his first term, and is doing a great job out there, and we're proud to have him among the ranks of our state attorneys general. And we also have today Ken Paxton, the great Attorney General for the great state of Texas. Also, if my information is correct, the 51st Attorney General for the state of Texas. Ken's in his second term and has been doing a terrific job on the religious liberties issues during the coronavirus response. Here in Kansas, we've had our share of issues related to government COVID responses and infringement on religious liberties since about April 8th. Those have been in the public domain, although we'd had extensive private discussions with other Kansas officials prior to that. Unfortunately, we weren't able to resolve all of those disputes. They wound up in a public way. I offered some guidance to Kansas law enforcement not to engage in criminal enforcement of our governor's executive orders as they applied to churches and other houses of worship. That resulted in 2 lawsuits, action by our legislature, a variety of public discussion back and forth, and ultimately the governor's decision to withdraw that executive order. And it has not been replaced as applied to churches, at least in the manner that we thought was discriminatory to start with. But our experience has not been alone. And I want to turn our attention now first to General Paxton. Ken, thank you for being part of this discussion today. Very early on in all of this, you issued guidance for houses of worship. How did the idea for Texas houses of worship guidance come about? Tell us about that.
So, just like every other state, this was a new phenomenon, this idea of having to shut businesses down and shut churches down. And so we wanted to be out front very quickly to make sure that churches and houses of worship and religious ceremonies were not infringed upon beyond what the Constitution would allow. Certainly, we recognize the government has a compelling interest to prevent the spread of a disease. And so, there's some tension sometimes when you're dealing with issues like this. And clearly, we hadn't dealt with an issue exactly like this. There wasn't a lot of guidance. We just felt like we needed to put out there for our leadership in this state and maybe for other states to look at as well, guidelines that would balance the strong interest that the founders had in the free exercise of religion. And so we probably, as it relates to any particular topic, we put out more guidance and were more specific about the freedoms allowed by for religious services and houses of worship than we were any other issue that we dealt with. So I think it was just this desire to make sure that government didn't come crashing down on the Constitution and during the midst of some fear of spreading this virus. So that was really the motivation, and I think it's worked out very well. I think our leadership in churches has been pleased with how our state has responded, and they've done a very responsible job of going online for the most part when they could afford it, and then working other ways out, drive up church. But they've been very creative and I think very responsible in how church leaders have responded.
Ken, are you able to share with us a little bit of the experience on what that's looked like on the ground? Obviously, general appreciation from the religious community, as you've just described, but what have you been able to head off, or what have you seen in terms of disputes in this guidance era?
I'm so pleased with the guidance because I really feel like we almost very little dispute with churches. Now, we were getting calls, we were fielding calls almost every day from pastors and church leaders and leaders of synagogues. We had to respond because the CDC had some guidelines that were very restrictive on and tried to guide rituals and liturgies for houses of worship and Jewish synagogues that we thought were highly questionable and probably unconstitutional. And so we actually ended up drafting a letter to the CDC, basically criticizing what they were doing and putting pressure on my state. And fortunately, as you're probably aware, the president came out saying that churches and houses of worship were essential businesses, are essential, and so they should be treated differently. And the CDC, amazingly, unfortunately, and I'm really grateful for this, drafted guidelines that were very similar to what we drafted. So it's taken some of the pressure off that we were feeling from the federal government to shut down houses of worship. And I think it's gone really, really well. Almost no disputes because of our early guidance.
Very good. Thank you. Let's pose a similar question to General Cameron. Daniel, you and I are in a similar boat, unlike General Paxton, where we have an attorney general of one party and a governor of the opposite party. And of course, it's not that these are political or partisan decisions, but philosophy does tend to play in here and certainly can affect priorities in some of these areas. So how have you balanced the need to protect citizens during the public health crisis while also ensuring that their First Amendment rights are not violated?
Well, look, I appreciate the question, General. And I want to say to you, I honestly looked very closely at what you were doing in Kansas, because just like you noted, you and I have a very similar dynamic as it relates to the governor being of one party and me being of the Republican, or I guess the governor being a Democrat, me being a Republican. And so my judgment was that everybody was going into this pandemic in good faith in terms of our elected leadership and the responsibility that our governors across the country, here in particular here in the Commonwealth, have to keep our citizens safe. And so we were watching very closely as these executive orders were being issued here in the Commonwealth. But what became really challenging for me is when I saw the order come from our governor basically telling churches that they could not have in-person church services. And there was an open question about whether they could have drive-in services. And so you look at a comment that was just made by Attorney General Barr a few weeks back, where he said, even in the midst of a pandemic, the Constitution is not suspended. That weighed heavily on me and weighed heavily on our office as we deliberated about what was our appropriate role in the midst of this pandemic in protecting and defending the First Amendment rights and all of our constitutional rights of our citizens. Ultimately, the decision was made. And I want to say there's an organization that most of you all are familiar with that are watching. And I know General Paxton, you certainly are, First Liberty, who came into Kentucky to help in a litigation in Louisville, Kentucky, related to drive-in services. That was sort of the first challenge, if you will, here in the Commonwealth. Our office supported that effort with an amicus brief because basically the mayor in Louisville was saying you can't even have drive-through church services, which just at its core did not seem right, while you were having liquor stores and other big box stores that were having a similar dynamic where folks were driving into those parking lots and were able to purchase their goods. So we jumped on that effort pretty quickly to provide amicus support to say that that was unconstitutional. We had a strong judge, Justin Walker, who found that that was unconstitutional and ruled in favor of the church and allowed them to have drive-through services. That was really the first shot across the bow here. And then the next effort was to challenge in-person church services. Again, in one hand, you have big box stores that have been allowed to be able to open during this entire pandemic, liquor stores open during this entire pandemic. And then you have churches in the other hand, which are protected by the First Amendment, all faith-based organizations protected by the First Amendment, yet they were closed. There was something inherently inconsistent and wrong with that picture. So we decided to join a lawsuit challenging the ability to have in-person faith-based gatherings. I will note that there were two judges appointed by two different presidents, one appointed by President Obama, the other appointed by President George W. Bush, who both found that Governor Beshear's executive order, as it applied to in-person church services, in-person faith-based gatherings, was unconstitutional. That was the position that we took in those particular litigations, whether it was through amicus support or actually joining the lawsuit. And we're very pleased to know that we had judges here in the Commonwealth that agree with that position and allowed the return of parishioners, congregants to their churches to have corporate worship. And what we've always said, and I know you all have said this as well, is that we want people to be judicious in deciding when they return to church and when it's appropriate for congregations to return. We want pastors and other faith-based leaders to be able to make those decisions. These executive orders, as they were written, did not allow for these decisions to be made by pastors and faith-based leaders with their congregations. So we were pleased to have those rulings come out of Kentucky here.
General, you've been so active on these issues, and I might just ask as a follow-up, I believe that you've had at least two, maybe more that I'm unaware of, at least two of these questions from Kentucky that have gone to the circuit court. And I believe the Sixth Circuit became one of the first appellate courts that addressed this sort of broad basket of issues that are continuing to arise as a result of the COVID response. Can you share with us anything about how the appellate advocacy went and just sort of what happened at the circuit, since that was really groundbreaking?
Yeah, so the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, again, basically affirmed the decisions that were being made here in Kentucky as it relates to drive-through services and in-person church services. They made the really profound judgment that the Constitution and our First Amendment rights as afforded to citizens all across this country are not to be taken away, even in the midst of a pandemic. We were obviously very pleased to see that decision. You know, that's why one rung away from the Supreme Court. And so it was, in my judgment, a good bellwether for if this was to ever make it to the Supreme Court, how this ultimately might play out. Again, you don't know, as General Paxton mentioned, you don't know how this will ultimately shake out in the beginning. And of course, you try to be patient and cautious. And I know, General Schmidt, you did the exact same thing in Kansas in terms of having discussions and being mindful of the safety precautions that were needed to be taken initially. But you have to balance the constitutional rights of citizens with the safety concerns as well. We think we've struck the right balance here in the Commonwealth. We're glad to see those judgments that we made here affirmed by the Sixth Circuit.
Well, very good, thank you. Let me turn to another question, and this is not for anybody specifically, but for all of us. So whoever wants to jump in, please do. Talk a little bit about how states have worked with federal partners on these baskets of religious liberty issues during the COVID response. General Cameron, you mentioned the recent statement by Attorney General Barr. Obviously, the feds have been quite active. And how have your respective offices interacted, either formally or otherwise, with our federal partners in the protection of religious liberties here?
Well, I'll just say I think I addressed a little bit of this earlier. We really haven't had a lot of interaction. I just have appreciated the statements by the president and Barr, which really help bolster what we're saying and make it easier for us to accomplish our goal, which is to make sure that people's constitutional rights are protected as it relates to their expression of their faith. And so I've just appreciated that backdrop. I mean, it would have been much harder if they had come out and had the opposite view. And truthfully, even though the CDC, I think, got it wrong when they started, I appreciate the fact that they listened to us. They took in input from us and redrafted their guidelines to, I think, match what the Constitution would allow. So it's been I can understand there's been a lot of confusion. We all have been through it, right? I mean, these questions are new questions. They haven't been easy. And, we're all wrestling with this interaction between protecting people's health and making sure that they're safe, and also making sure that they have freedom, and especially the freedoms that are granted by the First Amendment. And so I understand that, I don't expect us to get it right at every step, but we need to, as we're moving, keep getting better, keep refining. And I feel like, at least in Texas and at the federal level, that's happened.
Very good. How about you, Daniel, in Kentucky, with all of the litigation that's happened out there?
That's right. I've had some conversations with our U.S. attorneys here in the Eastern District and Western District, just to sort of keep them apprised of what's been occurring in terms of the litigation here. And really, the reason I did that is because I saw the Department of Justice, through their respective U.S. attorneys in Mississippi, get involved in some cases down there. And so I just wanted to make sure that we had established a relationship on that front with our U.S. attorneys here. But like General Paxton noted, the real big encourager for me personally was to see the statements that were made by General Barr. That gave this office some, again, some encouragement that we were looking at this with the right lens. We thought that we were viewing this appropriately, but it was nice to see that Attorney General Barr had made a similar statement about his concerns about the overreach of these executive orders as they were applying to churches. So it really was something that, as General Paxton noted, helped bolster our position and our decision to weigh into these particular cases. And what I'll say is that citizens all across the Commonwealth, and I know General Paxton and General Smith, I'm sure you all experienced this as well. Here in Kentucky, our citizens have been eager and very strong in their defense of their rights. And so that was also a big encourager for this office too.
Very good. Well, maybe this is a good time to pull out the crystal ball to the extent that lawyers can do that, and talk maybe just a little bit about what we see on the horizon, if anything. Here in Kansas, this is actually the first day under a further revised set of state level restrictions, which really are not much in the way of restrictions at all. Most of the enforceable limitations have now been devolved to local authorities, moved away from sort of a one size fits all approach. The governor's new directives are not criminally enforceable by their own terms, not just as applies to religious issues, but more generally. And so, today really is a step in a very different direction for us. On the religious issues in particular, from your vantage points, Daniel and Ken, what do you all see coming up? Now we have the president having declared that religious activities are essential. It's obviously set a benchmark, whether particularly enforceable or not. And yet at the same time, we have all this discussion about, will there be a second wave and might there be new restrictions? And particularly in some states that may be. So talk about what you think might be the issues that present themselves on the religious liberty issues going forward.
So Derek, just as an aside, you and I are a little older than Daniel. I just want to say I'm so impressed with what he's done in such a short period of time, especially as you said, he's having to deal with a governor that has very different views than his. And I don't know that when I was his age, I would be anywhere close to having the courage that he's had to stand up and do what he's done. And I don't know that people really understand, how hard that is. So I just want to first say, it's been really rewarding for me to watch Daniel Cameron do what he's done in Kentucky, because it's got national attention. And, I know it's not an easy decision to go sue your governor, right? I mean, it's it just, and especially when you're having to do it in your first 6 months in office. So as far as the future, I'm pretty optimistic. The governor's had to sort of take control from local officials here, because some of our local county judges have been pretty aggressive, and more aggressive than I think we as a state wanted to be. And so the governor has initially had devolved a lot of those decisions to county judges. And we have 254 counties. So you have a lot of different decisions, and you have big counties and small counties, and, Dallas County and Harris with Houston, and really small counties. And so the governor has taken a lot of that back, and in doing that, it's given a lot more freedom and reducing restrictions more quickly than I think especially some of the more urban counties that are more democratically controlled would have been more tightly controlled. And he did that also with religious issues and houses of worship. And I think because the governor has done, that the right way, pulling that back from the locals, I think our guidelines have stayed pretty solid. And I think that's going to be true in the future. Now, if we have a resurgent and the governor has to tighten things down, I really feel like the religious leaders will respond for the most part appropriately. I think they've done just such an excellent job of really asking us questions like, what can we really do? And, we get really sincere questions like, we want to do this. Can we do it? We don't want to, we really don't want to offend, government. We want to operate as much as we can. So I've been really impressed with this work with our guidelines and people really trying to stay within them and trying to do the right thing. While at the same time, in a crisis, you clearly have a lot of people that have needs, right? I mean, this is a stressful time for a lot of families and they need spiritual guidance. And so we've tried to make sure that, churches are free and houses of worship are free to address those.
Very good. Daniel, you have any crystal ball thoughts?
Well, look, I think this will be a really fascinating time. And look, General Paxton, there are countless times when I'm sitting in this office and at this desk, and I say, "What's Texas doing?" Because you all, from the beginning, have, in my judgment, struck the right balance. And so we've been trying to, in some ways, play catch up because of the difference between a Democratic governor and a Republican AG. But in terms of how this is going to play out in the coming weeks and months ahead, what we were arguing for and advocating for when we were defending the First Amendment rights of our citizens is that churches, other faith-based gatherings, and faith-based leaders have the ability to make the decisions about what to do with their congregations and corporate worship. Corporate worship, at least in my faith, the Christian faith, is so incredibly important. And you think about a lot of the big churches, I go to a big church in Louisville, Kentucky, had the ability, the capacity to have online streaming services. But you get out to some of our more rural counties, the ability to access internet, to have an online streaming service is just not there. And so what we were doing was trying to advocate that everyone would have access to go into a church or go into another faith-based meeting facility if they deemed appropriate, because that was their right under the First Amendment. So that's what we were looking for. But General Paxton is exactly right. Our church leaders, our faith-based leaders, all want to do right by their congregations and want to keep them safe. For instance, my church is still developing a plan for how to bring folks back into our church. They've even started to make steps. I know some churches have started to make steps to have small in-house gatherings of 10 to 20 people. So there will be incremental steps made based on the needs and concerns for particular churches. But what I'm so excited about is that they have the right and the ability to make those decisions without the chilling effect of an executive order telling them that they have to stay at home and they can't even make the decision about corporate worship. So that's what's most exciting about me. And in terms of the crystal ball aspect, I trust our faith leaders to make the right decisions necessary for their particular congregations.
Well, excellent points. Only one thing I might add from our vantage point, I would give a special shout out and point of gratitude to the many, many good organizations that have represented religious organizations in their legal challenges to some of these government actions. And I hope one thing that's going to come out of all this once the dust settles, we will all have some clearer, modern, I hope, well-reasoned case law to guide us when, God forbid, this happens again in some form, and we'll have something perhaps a little fresher than some 100-year-old case law to tell us how to manage those really difficult boundaries. So appreciate everybody who's picked up the ball on behalf of clients and ask courts to give us some clear guidance on that. We have a few minutes left here. Let me turn to a couple of audience questions that were submitted. And again, I'll put these on the table, and any or either of you, if you want to jump up and grab them, feel free. The first is Democratic governors and attorneys general have worked to maintain that abortions and marijuana are essential during this pandemic. Yet they've generally been more cautious to deem religious services as essential. Why do you think that is?
I think Daniel can answer the Democratic governor one better than I can.
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, I think you are seeing play out all across this country the priorities and values of the respective parties. And I think General Paxton and General Smith and myself certainly value the First Amendment and all of our constitutional rights, whereas I think some of our counterparts are more concerned about other values that I think some people sort of scratch their head about. How can a liquor store be open, but a church be closed? And that just didn't sit well with me. And how can an abortion facility continue to be deemed essential, but a church not deemed essential? Those were challenging, sort of head-scratching questions. And I know General Schmidt and General Paxton, I imagine you all have sort of scratched your head about those as well. You're seeing play out across this country the differences in values as it relates to those who are more concerned about the constitutional rights of our citizens versus perhaps the particular interest of a few. And so I'm proud of the work that we've done here, balancing the constitutional rights of our citizens versus the safety concerns that have to be seriously considered. But again, I think we've struck the right balance.
Very good. I think we have time for one more audience question that was submitted. So this will wrap it up. Feel free to answer the question and also offer any final thoughts you may want to overall. So some cities in your states, my state as well, have placed strict limits on religious worship. Each of you have mentioned examples of that in comments already today. How have your offices responded beyond what we've already said? And what can be done to prevent further infringements on the First Amendment by localities as this all moves forward?
So Derek, I'm really appreciative of Raga putting this together. I think it's interesting. I think we have dealt with more religious liberty issues in my term than I would have ever expected, even before this happened. And, we not only have the job of representing our states, our governors, our legislatures, our agencies in all kinds of different issues, but we also swore to uphold the Constitution. And part of that is making sure that our citizens have their rights respected and that they have their rights under the Constitution. So, it's been interesting. We have had to deal with some of our, especially our larger counties that have tried to restrict houses of worship. And, fortunately, I think it's gone pretty well. We've sent out letters under the Disaster Act in Texas. I have new responsibilities. One of them is not just to advise the governor, but to advise county judges, which there are 254, and mayors. And so we don't have any ability to force them to do anything necessarily, but we are advisors. And so they don't always ask for our advice, but we sometimes give it anyway. And we did that to 3 of our major counties and 2 of our cities, including Dallas, Travis, which is where Austin is, and Bear, which is where San Antonio is, basically telling them they couldn't restrict houses of worship more than our guidance allowed, because that was what the governor also issued. He issued basically the joint guidance with us. And so it seemed to work. I mean, some of the counties literally adopted, even some of the ones that had more restrictions than were allowed, immediately adopted those guidelines, and others just stopped speaking to their own enforcement against churches and houses of worship. And so that's been our response, and we've been fortunate that we've never had to go to court to stop this. And it's been a definitely an experiment in democracy, and I feel like it's over a period of time we've slowly but surely kind of balanced it out so that we are protecting people's health at the same time allowing them their rights under the Constitution.
Very good, Ken. Thank you. Daniel, any final words of wisdom here?
Well, look, I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and we've already talked about others that have, General Schmidt, you noted that there have been others that Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty and other groups that have been involved in the fight here. And I know I've had conversations with those groups really as an encouragement. So we've just got to, in our times in office, do what's right. Maybe it's not always the easy thing to do, but we've got a responsibility to stand up for the constitutional rights of our citizens in our respective states and commonwealths. And I appreciate the 2 of you all being the wise leaders that you are, and giving me a North Star, so to speak, to look to for encouragement and strength when I'm making these decisions here in the Commonwealth. So I appreciate you all.
Very good. Well, our time has run here. I want to thank RLDF for hosting this conversation today, and everybody who's participated. Thank you for joining. Thanks for all you've been doing on the important issue of religious liberties in the states, especially in the COVID response. Especially grateful to my good friends, General Cameron, General Paxton. Thank you for taking time to do this. Thanks for standing up for what's right. And I, at least in this time when we can't get together and find a little support in each other, perhaps as readily as we're accustomed to, I have taken great comfort in knowing that there are folks like you out there, and that we're not alone as we make some of these tough choices. So thanks to everybody. I wish everybody a safe rest of the day, and God bless you all.